Welcome to today's episode. Today I have Terry Baranski with me, who's an IFS therapist and is also schooled in compassionate inquiry, Gabor Mate's jam, I guess we could call it, and that kind of thing. So welcome, Terry.
Thanks so much, Russ. Great to be here.
Yeah. Do you want to tell us a little bit about, why you got into this? I read in your bio and stuff, you were a computer scientist at one time and then you moved into therapy. Now those are two different mindsets. So I'm just like, how did that kind of come about?
Yeah, it's amazing even when I think about it. Now, I had done IT for the longest time, 15 plus years, and it was great. And the passion started to wane, I found over time, but I really had just resigned myself to just continuing to do it because there was nothing else,
Sure.
there were no other options conceivable to me. And then I just fell into this world of developmental psychology and trauma. Ran into a video about it. I don't even know how. I wasn't looking for it, and it just resonated immediately.
Right.
And because it explains so much that otherwise is impossible to explain about society, myself, what we see in the world, the way the world's going. And so I was hooked just from an intellectual perspective at first, and then it just gradually became clear once I discovered IFS and really dug into this stuff deeply. And then I experienced IFS as a client and was like, wow, this sounded great in the books, but it actually works. Really well too. And at some point in there, it became clear that this was a new career call. And the universe brought it to me when I was ready for it. That's kind of how I look at it, and it's been an amazing transition. So it's great to have passion for work again.
Yeah, I actually read about one of the things you say that I totally agree with is traditional therapy, the way it's taught in the universities, is antiquated. Like you use that word antiquated, it's like that's just a perfect word for it, because at one time I think it did provide some kind of structure or relief for people, but it didn't really get to the root cause. So, and that's the other thing I feel about science sometimes. Like I've got a degree in medicine and a degree in neuroscience and stuff, and I just find that science is great. Science will help you cope, but it doesn't actually help you heal. So I'm seeing as people get more and more stressed, as people get more and more disillusioned with the world, they start looking for certainty. And one of the things you look for in certainty, and why people are attracted to science in the first place, is there's a certain certainty to that. So, and then you being an IT guy, there's a certain certainty to what you know about that. And then you go into this other field like I did with medicine. I finished medicine in 2013 because it's like, I just can't do this anymore. I can't just keep giving out medications for stuff that I can see is deeper there. So we both sort of hit the wall as far as our respective careers go, and then decided to do something different, and then found something that works for us. So somatic therapy worked for me. IFS worked for me. I don't know a whole lot about compassionate inquiry, but I'm sure it's probably, parallel on some levels and stuff. So what do you find really helpful with IFS, being an IFS therapist?
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple things with it. I think fundamentally, and you touched on this, like the vast majority of therapies out there are what I call top down, meaning they work with conscious processes, conscious behaviors, and they look at what we're seeing on the surface in terms of behavioral patterns, emotional dysregulation, and they try to add skills and exercises on top of that, and coping strategies and affirmations and all these things to try and, it's a principle of addition. Like we're trying to add skills on top of what's already there. And it's not that can't be helpful, but as you said, it doesn't get to the root of anything. We're dealing with symptoms, and that fundamentally, and there are a very small number of approaches, and IFS is one of them that take a different view, where IFS is bottom up. So with IFS, we recognize that what we see, these behaviors and emotional patterns that we see, are symptoms of underlying dynamics and underlying processes going on largely in the unconscious. So the genius of IFS when it was developed was this notion of asking why. Why am I feeling this way? Why am I behaving this way, even though some part of me knows I shouldn't do X, Y, Z, but I keep doing it anyway.
Right.
So we get curious,
right?
Which for a therapist is a pretty rare thing, because we have all the answers, right? So why would we ask that? So what Dick Schwartz, who created IFS, he didn't come into it with a mindset or a theory. He was doing traditional family systems therapy, and he found that it wasn't working. And so that's what he started asking his clients, why do you keep doing this?
Right.
Like just from a place of curiosity. Like, why do you keep eating this way? Why did you cut yourself? And then they started explaining to him how their minds were working. And that's what he built this approach off of. So it has a very organic history, which I love about it, because he followed the data, so to speak, not the objective, like this is what this study says, that study says, but what his subjectively, what people were reporting to him, because that's really what matters, is what the client is experiencing. And so, that question of why is so important, because we get below the symptoms that way, and we find out, okay, what is driving, because there's always a reason. It's not genetic. There's no evidence of genetics causing any mental health condition. It's not random. There's always a reason. There's an intelligence within us. There are always reasons for these things, no matter how harmful a behavior is, no matter how hurtful it is. There's always reasons. So when we trace that back, now we're in a position to be able to address it from the bottom up. Okay, now I know what's causing it. Now let's see how can we help that. Yeah. And so, the analogy I like to give is like if you have a really bad itch, right, and you're scratching and scratching and scratching, and it's getting worse because you're scratching, you go to a dermatologist. The dermatologist is not going to focus on the scratching. They're not going to teach you skills on how to scratch less, on how to cope with the desire to scratch, right, or distract yourself when you have the urge to scratch. And the reason they're not going to do that is because they know that the itch is the issue. And once the itch is resolved, the scratch will go away as a natural consequence. And that is exactly what we see with so-called mental illnesses.
Right.
Where there's always a reason, and once those reasons are addressed, whatever the symptoms were, go away or largely abate as a natural consequence of dealing with what's underneath there.
Yeah, it's kind of like managers and firefighters too in IFS. It's like these are the responses that are protective, and over time they put layers on the onion as opposed to taking layers off the onion. And I guess what IFS does, the way I see it too, is that it's kind of like exposing these layers piece by piece so that the self, the higher version of us, can kind of say, oh, and have a little more agency in how do I behave here? How do I learn how to this is how I used to do it. I could do that again, but what if I did it this way? What if I did it some another way? I have this acronym called MADS, nothing against Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, but it's medications, addictions, dissociations, and distractions. And I think these are kind of what the firefighters do. They drive us into our medications, our addictions, our dissociations, and our distractions, because they prevent us on some level or buffer us from feeling that old pain. And I think when we realize that if you actually go into the old pain, if you stay with it and don't completely add thoughts to it or coping strategies to it, you actually start to chip away at the root cause of it, as opposed to just managing it outside of itself. So when you just manage it, it never changes. You never give it a chance to change. So in a way, a lot of these cognitive strategies are dangling people over the gates of hell, because they give them a little bit of what they need, but not enough to actually go in and make the full-time changes they need to actually get at the root cause of the problem. Would that kind of sum up what you are talking about?
I totally agree.
Yeah.
And look, these cognitive approaches, their heart is in the right place. They're trying their best. It's
And
how they're trained.
Help. I think they do help. I mean, there's certainly evidence to suggest that CBT and that kind of stuff has some efficacy in helping the symptoms, for sure. But it's the same as, when you go to a dermatologist with an itch, you're going to get a cortisone. You're going to get some sort of cortisone cream, and that's the joke among us doctors, is that all the dermatologists do is like, they just choose which particular cortisone cream they're going to use. Now it's more complicated than that, of course, but it's a joke that we have among doctors, that dermatologists, basically, they just use different cortisone creams for the same thing. So you're not really getting at the underlying cause. And the thing about skin conditions is so often they reflect something deeper. And Kathy Kane talks about this too. Kathy Kane is kind of one of my idols in sort of somatic therapy. And she talks about, it's, in a way, it's good that it comes up, because it's actually expressing itself in the skin. It's not stuck underneath anymore. Now, ask somebody with bad eczema or bad psoriasis, they'll probably disagree, but it's really something to see that the symptoms that we get, these physical symptoms that we get, are so often related to this emotional issue that's never been resolved. What I call alarm in the system, what I call this state of alarm that's held in our system, that is basically an effigy of our younger selves that never did get the chance to be seen, heard, loved, and protected. And trying to give them that now in a way that they didn't get back then.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing that we have, this mind-body separation stuff that started in the 1600s.
Right.
We've come so far on that because even chronic physical conditions, autoimmune diseases, cancer. Gabor Mate has wrote a book about this. Like the
Yep.
evidence is overwhelming that those are the result of personality traits and coping strategies that we take on as the result of trauma. So it's all one thing. And if I have one gripe about some of the somatic approaches, is that they when they say it's all in the body, they're kind of splitting mind and body
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
And it's it's a semantic thing, so it's not the end of the. But there's a lot of that. To me, it's both. That mind body is one thing, and that's what we find with IFS. Wherever these parts, there's a somatic piece to it, because normally a part is you can find it in the body somewhere, and that's kind of how we anchor it. But we have to, the mind is clearly involved too. So rather than
Totally.
separating those two, we just say, okay, we're going to work with the part, however it manifests, and that's where the magic's at with this approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason why somatic therapies are so goal directed in their assertion that trauma is held in the body is because it's been such an antithesis to traditional therapy. Is that they believe that everything's held in the nervous tissue. And I remember having a little scrap with somebody on Instagram not that long ago about, well, you're saying that trauma is held in the body, and it's like there's no evidence that ever has happened, and just like you're using this to cheat people out of their money, and it's like, well, do you agree that trauma is held? We hold trauma somewhere. It's like, well, yes, and it's like, well. And then you assume that it's just in the nervous tissue. It's like, yes. It's like, well, can you separate the mind and the body? And she says, well, no. Well, then by definition, trauma is held in the body as well as the mind. Of course it is. We can't separate it out. So we have to watch out for these reductionistic strategies, but these reductionistic strategies actually lead us to different therapies. And I think that's why, it is this sort of chicken or the egg kind of paradox in there, is that we have to see that, yes, it's the mind and the body together that's created these things. So we can create thinking strategies that make us feel better. We can create feeling strategies that make us feel better. But can we integrate the two? And I think on some level, that's what somatic experiencing does. IFS does it in a different way, but it's the same kind of thing. So my thing, now that we're sort of getting into it, is that I think that somatic therapies don't break things up into parts enough. And I think that IFS therapies don't break things into the child version of us enough, into the, how do I say it? The minutia of how you feel that in the body. There's a part of our brain called the insula, the insular cortex. And the insular cortex has been shown in many, many studies with childhood trauma to have difficulty programming and processing information. So the insular cortex is kind of like the way station between top down and bottom up. So if we look at the insular cortex, if there's disruption in that, our mind-body connection is by definition faulty, and it doesn't work very well. So I believe that anxiety, what I deal with specifically, is a separation of the mind from the body and the adult self from the child self. So in IFS, that would be the child parts from the self. So it's the same kind of thing. It's just we're sort of using different semantics to describe the same kind of thing. And I think all the therapies have benefit. Some maybe work better for some people and some maybe work better for others. But it's just finding that there is a somatic component to it is so important to healing in general, which most mainstream therapy doesn't address at all.
Right.
That was a bit of a
they're
rant.
very wrapped up in the left side of the brain.
Uh-huh.
Totally agree. And that has little, if anything, to do with actually healing trauma. You can cope with it that way.
Absolutely.
And that's what a lot of parts will do. And a lot of what we call rational or thinking parts, they're great at trying to maintain control over everything and keeping us busy to distract from, what's under there. So I'd love to give a quick overview of IFS if I could. Yeah, just to kind of set the context. In addition to the top-down, bottom-up thing, I think that the big thing that separates IFS is we've been talking about this notion of parts. So typically in this culture, especially, we think of the mind as one thing. When we say I or we say me,
right,
we're typically referring to a single entity, which is very helpful in conversation. It's a useful abstraction. But what we find, and this has been pointed out really throughout recorded history, Socrates, Plato, Nietzsche, Jung, Freud all talked about it, is the IFS view is that the mind actually consists of parts rather than being a single thing. And these parts are completely normal. number one. They're not the result of trauma. We're born with them. It's just seen as how the human mind works. They are little sub-personalities in there. They're more than just emotions. We'll often use the emotion to key off of them initially, like, oh, this part is feeling this. But what we find is that they have their own ways of thinking and viewing the world. And it really is quite amazing when we get in there and you can just kind of feel the different energy that different parts have and the different personalities, just like different people. These parts interact with each other. Some work with each other, others work against each other. Some like each other, some don't. And a lot of times they'll have different views on what's best for the system. Totally. And so it's like the inner system's at war with itself. And that's the norm, especially now. Like the amount of trauma that we're carrying goes up. Polarities within the system are inevitable. And so there's infighting. And so that's where the inner critics come from. Really what that critic is doing is criticizing how other parts are operating day to day. And then that's triggering shame in other parts. So there's this triangle in there that we can talk about. But so that's where a lot of our energy is spent in being conflicted, being polarized. And then again, trauma doesn't create the parts, but our parts carry our trauma in this approach. And so they take on roles in the system, protective roles, to try and prevent further trauma. And that's a lot of the behaviors that we subsequently see as adults. And then other parts, who we call exiles, are actually the ones carrying the pain that was inflicted on us, the attachment wounds, the abandonment wounds, whatever the case may be. And so these parts are all there. I mean, there's so much about this, but one of the beautiful things that I find with people is it really turns on the self-compassion right away.
Totally.
So as opposed to in a cognitive model, practicing self-compassion every day, telling yourself certain things that are trying to be compassionate, what we find with IFS is that just when we start getting to know these parts, it just arises naturally, because we see, oh, you know what, this anxiety, just for example, that I've been fighting against for years, if not decades, is actually trying to help me. It's a coping strategy this part took on decades ago that quite possibly saved my life back then. A lot of these things start as survival responses.
Absolutely.
And then the parts just don't, like, the parts are stuck back there in time, so they don't know it's 2024 now. We're grown up now. We have different strengths now than we had. And so when we learn that, we can stop fighting against these things and work with them rather than against them, to see, okay, what do you need? Like, tell me more about the anxiety. Like, and then to summarize a whole process, like, we figure out how we can help the part. And then we see that, okay, the part realizes, okay, I don't need to bring this anxiety anymore because we've done all this healing over here. So really an amazing thing, but that self-compassion is something, and you talk about it in your book. It really is hard when we've been suffering for so long. We just want the symptoms to go away, and that can actually block us. There's this irony of the more we want change, the harder it is
without
to
get
there. And that's what I see a lot of times.
So from the neuroscience of this, and this is why I love sort of breaking this down. So that I have this, like you must have this sort of, I can tell you have a highly analytical mind, but you also have this ability to kind of go into the right brain too. So I think we share that kind of thing. So there's a part of our brain called the default mode network. So basically it's what your brain does when you're not doing anything. So they studied it. They figured it out about 20 years ago. They put people in an MRI scanner and they gave them tasks, like math tasks or whatever. And they noticed that their brain would get into a particular rhythm, that they could see. And then when it stopped, when they didn't have a problem to solve or something like that, they would default into this sort of baseline state of default mode network. Now, there's a part of our brain called the posterior cingulate cortex. And posterior cingulate cortex is thought to be involved in self-referential thought, like what you think about yourself. So if you have childhood trauma, I have this acronym that you may have seen in the book called JABS. So judgment, abandonment, blame, and shame. This is what we do towards ourselves. This is what I believe. It's very simplistic, but it's sort of held in this posterior cingulate cortex, so that when we aren't doing anything specifically, we default into this place, and then we automatically default into judging ourselves, abandoning ourselves, blaming ourselves, shaming ourselves as a coping strategy, because as a child, that did distract us from it. So it's interesting what you say. The other thing that I wanted to touch on there with what you said, like Chris Palmer, who's a Harvard-trained psychiatrist, has this book called Brain Energy. And he talks about how it's not so much trauma that causes this. It's a disruption in metabolism that causes these schizophrenia, bipolar, eating disorders, all this kind of stuff. And to some extent, I think it's a reasonable hypothesis, but I think it's both. I think trauma does disrupt the metabolism, which I'm coming. This is my long way of coming back to what you were saying, is that when the parts are fighting with each other, it takes a tremendous amount of energy away from the brain. So if you grow up in an environment where you are secure and attached and you have loving parents, what I call, you go through the primary pathways of the brain for love and connection. If you don't get that, if you start getting traumatized, you go through these secondary pathways, which in a way would be kind of the forming of the exiles, the forming of parts of the brain that sort of branch off, and then the firefighters and the managers go on top of that. So they're all fighting with each other, essentially, or trying to hold sway. And that takes a tremendous amount of energy. And if there is some predisposition in the brain to anxiety, depression, whatever it is, I know we can't find that yet genetically, but I think there is. Like, why do some people go to anxiety? Why do some people go to depression? There's a whole, there's so many theories behind it. So what I would say is it's really interesting to see that when you talk about this, it reminds me that when the parts are all in conflict with each other, the self loses its power. It's a tremendously hypoenergetic or energy dysfunctional environment for the brain to be in.
Yeah. And the analogy I like, I don't know, I didn't come up with this myself. I don't remember who said it, but it's like holding a beach ball underwater.
That's me.
Did you? Is that yours?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I've been saying that for years, but I see it written somewhere. But yeah.
Gotcha. I love it.
It's a tremendous amount of power.
Yeah.
And then when you let it go, it explodes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And you can hold it under, but it gets tiring.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Yeah, I use that too. But and then we wonder why am I tired all the time?
Mm-hmm.
I seem to be sleeping enough. Isn't that weird? Why do I need 3 cups of coffee a day?
Right.
To function? So these are all side effects of exactly what you're talking about, and those parts fighting with each other. Again, I love looking at this as, okay, like, why would self-blame come online in the first place? And I said before, there's always a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you consider a child being traumatized, right, not a one-time or
right,
either a one-time thing or a chronic thing, right? The child has 2 options, and let's say their parents are the ones traumatizing them. The child can blame their parents and get angry, and quite likely make things worse by doing that, because the parents are probably not going to respond well based on what's already going on in the house.
True.
The other option is the child can blame themselves and say, okay, what can I do differently to fix this? How can I change myself to create a better attachment relationship?
Right.
So that I'm more secure and I'm being traumatized less. So that self-blame is a very, very intelligent function that, as far as I'm concerned, nature put in us. It's unconscious. None of this is conscious. It's just what the child does so that they can try to, as best they can, fix or at least help the situation. So that's a role to me that parts of us take on. And then those become the inner critics who really drive us crazy later in life. Anything we do wrong, they're right on top of us. They then trigger other parts who are already carrying shame. So then we feel shamed because of the inner critic. And that's not what the critic wants.
Right.
It's just trying to help like it did when we were young. But again, it's stuck in another, like the time, the time works very differently inside. So the parts are literally stuck. We'll find them in these scenes and in these times from the past. And they have no idea, as I mentioned, that we're adults now and it's decades later. So a lot of energy being spent. It's energy that was an intelligent use of energy back when this was happening, but it just keeps happening. And then as it does, we tend to take on more trauma throughout life because we put ourselves in bad relationship situations or, there's a million things. So trauma begets trauma. I love saying that. And then once we start addressing it at the root, we find not only do we feel better, but we're not putting ourselves in bad situations in the present anymore to get further traumatized.
Yeah, that's the old Freudian repetition compulsion, right? So whatever was familiar to you in childhood, because human beings equate familiarity with safety and security, even if that familiarity was being hit or being abused. So we have this unconscious compulsion to repeat that. And I would see that as a family doctor. I would see that in families. I would see, people pleasing, compulsive people pleasing go right through families. Alcoholism go right through families. So, and I want to go back to what you were a little bit about what you were saying earlier. Like anger is a defense mechanism for the child. So if the parents remove anger from the child, they basically turn them into a victim because they have no way of protecting themselves anymore. Because if their anger is taken away, there's no way of protecting yourself if you're not allowed to get angry. So then you have to find a reason why you're angry. And, the brain being as intelligent as it is, it will find these different judgments, abandonments, blames, and shames that make sense of what they're feeling at that particular time. And then that gets kind of grandfathered in because it's repeated over and over and over again, I think, through this posterior cingulate cortex. And we create this powerful, powerful default mode network where we default into a feeling of negativity towards ourselves. And then the mind, being a compulsive meaning-making, make sense machine, says, okay, well, we feel shameful, we feel bad. What do we have to feel bad about, right? So then it's like, well, last week when I was at the store and I gave that cashier, not enough money or whatever, and I left the store and I forgot about it. There's all these little goofy things that our mind will just completely scramble to find the reason why this happened. And we're totally missing the point. The point is to sort of go inside, find it. Okay, where is that feeling? Where is that part? Can you put your hand over it? Can you connect with it? Can you breathe into it? Can you just allow yourself to feel it? Because the reason why you've developed these elaborate coping strategies is to not feel it. And that's our society. It's like, don't feel, like retail therapy, like don't feel negative emotion. Don't feel grief. Someone's the family's died. It's like, well, things will get better. Like there's this automatic knee-jerk thing to try and make someone feel better. And it's so devastating to our collective mental health to not be able to deal with negative emotion.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, and this is another thing where, like, when we go back to childhood and our nervous systems are not mature yet, so a lot of times, like, these emotions that we would naturally feel as a result of trauma, they would overwhelm us when we're young. The nervous system would, in a lot of situations, shut down and maybe even kill us based on how severe a lot of these things are.
Right.
So the ability to dissociate from that one way or another is, again, a survival response.
Sure.
It's a coping strategy, but it's one that outlives its usefulness eventually. And what we find is that as adults, we become so scared of feeling these things. And I hear this from parts all the time. I'll ask someone, any anxieties coming into this about this process? I'm afraid of being overwhelmed. I'm afraid of things getting worse. And that fear caused it because that was true during childhood.
That was their childhood experience.
Right? Yeah. Yeah. And so now as an adult, that fear keeps us pushing these things down. I don't want to feel these things. I just want to get on with my life. How can I get rid of these emotions so I can get on with life? But, the thing that I love, you mentioned capital S self, and an IFS self is it's the aspect of us that's not a part. Right. It's our essence. It's our seat of consciousness. Every spiritual tradition has a word for it. Buddha nature, Atman, all these things. So this is not unique to IFS. But what we find is when self is there to experience the emotions that the part is carrying, self doesn't get overwhelmed because self isn't afraid. If as soon as we stop pushing the emotion away, like when we do that, the emotion pushes back and gets more intense. As soon as we stop doing that, and self can say to a part, okay, share with me genuinely everything you want me to know. What are you feeling? What are you carrying? The part will do that, and it is intense, but it's not overwhelming, and it's not this, oh my God, it's never going to go away stuff. It just passes through, oftentimes in minutes. In a session, like a part will share years worth of emotion it's carrying in minutes, and then there's this lightness that comes in. Like it's the part feels completely differently, and at that point, because we've been pushing it down for decades, we release that pressure. The part can express itself, and now the part's like, oh my God, I've finally been heard, which is what the part wanted since the trauma was happening.
Yeah,
someone to hear me, to understand what I'm feeling, what my needs are. And so a lot of this is what I call inner attachment work in IFS. It's the self-forming relationships with these parts, hearing their stories, and that's where the healing is at. And when I talk about it, it sounds kind of simple and straight, but it is so powerful when you experience it. And that's what I found doing this as a client. I'm like, okay, I've read about these things. Sounds great. Sounds a little too easy even, but then when I experience it, I'm like, wow. Yeah. Like this actually works. It's an amazing thing.
Yeah, I think it's, and those parts are childlike, and the amygdala has no sense of time. The basolateral amygdala will kick in and fire these energies into your body at anything that's even reminiscent of what you went through as a child. So I have this one patient who was yelled at by her mother a lot, and then went through the grocery store. This is years ago now. I keep telling this story like it was yesterday, but a mother was yelling at her child at the 2 aisles over, and she completely went into panic. And it's like, well, that's your amygdala, and your amygdala is basically taking you back to that 6-year-old in you, because the amygdala has no sense of time. It has no sense of time. So it will take you back to those particular places and make you feel exactly like now, like you did then. And this is the insular cortex again. The insular cortex has this sort of sense of your body in your brain. So it has this mental picture of your brain in this insular cortex. And it also holds your traumas. There's a lot of trauma that's held in this particular insular cortex, along with other things, of course. But this is what I think we're starting to see more and more when we look at neuroanatomy, when we look at these experiments that involve the insula in trauma, because the insula is how we connect our body to our mind. And if it's impaired, we can't connect our body to our mind. So these traumas don't get accessed. So as we improve this connection with our body, with our parts, we can start moving them around a little bit. We can open them up a little bit. We can see them a little more. So this is kind of like the neuroscientific example of why this is supposed to work. It's one theory. I mean, there's a bunch of theories as well, but it's really about, we have this part in us that goes right back to that same place. We feel exactly the same way now in our body that we did when our mother was yelling at us when we were 6 years old in the grocery store. So of course we're going to react in a very immature way. I often like to say that any emotional overreaction is an age regression. So if you see somebody losing their shit, they're in an age regression. So don't antagonize them anymore. Try and find that part, and that childhood part, because that's the golden road. That's the way in.
Love that. Yeah, we have an expression, so and so is acting like a child, and it's literally true. Like that is exactly what's going on. And it explains so much, when someone loses their temper and 10 minutes later they're like, what just happened?
Right, exactly.
What is what would happen was, in my language, a part of you took over who's carrying anger from the past. And so that reaction that we saw had nothing to do with the present. It was triggered by the present. But the anger that came out is actually about the past. And it's been in there for a long time, and that's why it's so intense. And that's true of, fear, anxiety, sadness, any emotion. Like when you said it perfectly, when we have a strong reaction to something, almost invariably, there's the spark that happened in the present. Yeah. And then there's the gasoline that we're carrying from the trauma. And that's what we're reacting to.
And if we can use self-energy to kind of see it as it's coming, because once the wave is over us and smashes us, there's really not a whole lot we can do in that particular moment. I guess it's learning, and this is what somatic therapy sort of, leans into, is like, what are the precursors? Like, what do you feel before, as this energy is starting to build? What's going on in your system? Well, there's this tingling in my belly that I never thought of before. And then it sort of rises up into my chest, and it becomes this kind of burning, hot hourglass hollows. And the way people describe it is quite intense. And it's like, okay, when you get to that place of feeling that tingling in your belly, can we put our hand over that? Can we feel that? Can we allow ourselves to go into that place first? And that, I think, is kind of like a portal into the child, into that place, that part. If we can find the prodrome, if we can find it as it builds, we can do something about it. We can turn off the highway. But if we don't see it, we're destined to be it. It's just going to run like down that 12-lane superhighway that's been created there since you've been like 5 years old.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of these things, what I tell people is, okay, we get triggered, something happens. You're right. In that moment, very difficult. It'll come with time as the parts get triggered less. But when we're first starting off, you have almost no chance in the moment of catching it.
Yeah.
But as soon as you realize afterwards, oh, that's interesting, I just got triggered. Like that, from my perspective, is you now have a little guidepost of a part in there who needs help that you probably didn't know about 5 minutes before. you got triggered. So in it, I don't like the term reframe. I'm not a fan, but it
Yeah.
kind of is like it's unfortunate I got triggered, but there's a silver lining in the sense that now I know there's a part in there carrying something. And I can
Yeah.
find that part by taking myself back to this situation that just triggered me. And then I can see, okay, what help does this part need? And then next time, when I heal that part and it's not carrying all this gasoline
Mm-hmm.
from the past anymore, things will still happen that make us angry. Anger, as you said, is a normal boundary setting
It's
emotion that
protective.
we have for
Yeah.
a reason.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's a very different experience when it's anger purely in the present without all this stuff from the past on
Mm-hmm.
top of it. Very, very different experience at that point. We're in control. We don't wonder 10 minutes later what happened. Like it's
Yep.
justified anger in the present. And the example I give is if when you see animals, on a nature show in the wild getting angry with each other, like normally it's about territory.
Right.
Like two ducks will cross paths and they're like, and they get angry and it's over in 10 seconds.
Yeah.
They set the boundary and
Yep.
they go right back to the way they were before the anger. They're not stewing for the next half hour
They
about
flap
it.
their
That's
wings.
anger in the present.
They flap
Yeah.
their wings. They discharge the energy. This is page 137 in A New Earth, Eckhart Tolle's book, A New Earth, where he talks about the ducks in the pond. And then he says, if that was human beings, the ducks would be swimming away. Like, how dare he come up to me like that? He knows this is my part of the pond. Why is he doing this? I'm going to have to figure this out. Why did I do something wrong? So it's one of my favorite parts of that book for sure. Is just this cognitive. And I really love what you said about reframe there, because reframe is assuming we're going forward with something. It's like, no, we're actually needing to go backward. And then it creates this thing. And what I describe to people when I do some kind of IFS with them, I have my own little version of it, is it's like self-awareness. Like it's aware that there is something bigger than you, inside of you, than this emotion. Now, you may not feel it right now. You may feel completely overwhelmed by this emotion, but that self-awareness is there. It is waiting for you to sort of pay your attention to it, because whatever we pay attention to, we get more of. So if you start paying attention to this internal sense of self, this higher version of you, it's not that you're just, I'm above this. I'm not going to get angry. I'm not going to, it's like, no, it's like, can you be aware in every second of every moment that this is how it's building? Can you feel it? Can you allow yourself to be there and know that it will be contained by self? Now, early on, it's not. So I think that's why it's so hard to heal, because you think, okay, well, I'll be aware of myself. This is what they told me. This is what I read about in the IFS book. I'll just be aware of self and I'll just be able to stay with it. Now, early on, you can't stay with it. It's too overwhelming, because that amygdala takes you back to being this 5-year-old where the horrible thing was everything. There was nothing else, because you didn't have any, you were a powerless child at the time. But now there is something else. Now you can actually access something that says, okay, I can absorb this. There's part of me that actually can absorb this. I don't like it. And in somatic experiencing, they say, well, we dip our toe in it. We dip our toe in the trauma. We come back out. We regulate in the body. We dip our toe back in. We regulate. We come back out. And IFS is a similar thing, I would imagine, is that you're showing yourself that there is this part of you called the self that will be able to handle this. Maybe you can't handle it right now. And just because you can't do it immediately, just because you can't sort of, okay, well, myself is going to take over and I'm going to be fine. Just because you can't do it immediately doesn't mean it doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of it is, there's some expectation management. Everyone's different, but that it's another one of these seeming dualities where the more, if we have the attitude, and it's a very well-meaning one, well, I'm going to tap into self all day and not get triggered. That's actually a part saying that.
Yeah.
Like self would say that, right? That's a part trying to keep the other parts, like you just said, I don't want to feel this.
Yeah.
Right. But what we find is that's why so much of IFS is inner relationship building.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. When we have the relationships with the parts, when the parts start to trust the self, because self can't control when a part takes over. The part has to the part can completely take over if it wants to. But once the part trusts the self, that, hey, there's an adult in here now. And I trust that, and that he's been here more than once. Like he's a regular presence in here now.
Right.
Now I don't need to take over as much. If self wants to come in, I can pull my energy back a bit, maybe to half what it was, and allow some space for self to be here, so self can relate to me and vice versa. Because I know self's going to listen. to what I'm feeling and take me seriously and not try to push me away or change me. That's the big shift up front.
Yeah.
Like that relationship has to, it's just like if you meet a friend's kid, there's no trust there right away.
Mm-hmm.
So it is unlikely that if you ask the kid, if the kid wants to get angry at you for some reason, that he's going to be interested in your thoughts on whether he should be angry or not. But when there's trust there, and he knows, again, you're not trying to change him, fix him, push him away, that's a very different situation. Now there's attunement there, and that's everything.
It reminds me of what Gordon Neufeld talks about, because I did a lot of work at the Neufeld Institute in developmental psychology. And he says, unless you feed a child, they can never fully develop this trust in you, right? So I remember going over to a friend of mine's house the other day, and I was going to meet her kids, and I brought over this, sourdough banana bread loaf, and I gave them each a little bit of it, and they loved me, right? It's like, there is something just primal about that sense of trust. But I wanted to go back again, because there's so many things you talk about that I love going back to. It's this sense of understanding that there is this other presence there. Because I think when we're younger and we experience trauma that's too much for us to bear, and we do stuff it down into parts or repress or suppress or whatever Freudian term that you want to use, is that we develop this sense that the world isn't trustable, the world isn't safe, right? So if I have this internal mistrust of life and self in general, or life in general, when the self comes along, I'm not going to trust the self, even though I feel that it's going to help me. There's going to take a while before that self builds up that trust, so that the part actually lets things go. Because one of the things about trauma when you're younger is that when you have trauma that's too much for you to bear, you lose faith in the world. You lose trust and faith in the world. And the natural corollary of that is, everything is up to me now. Like, it's not said to you or anything like that, but there is this sense. So everything is up to the part now. And the part becomes this omnipotent thing. I call it the ego dragon. Part of it, one of the parts is the ego dragon. And it's this tremendously powerful, but not that smart entity within us that tries to protect us all the time. It's always trying to protect us. So if you're, in high school or junior high school or even elementary school, and you're doing show and tell, and you drop whatever it was and it breaks on the ground and everyone laughs at you, that ego dragon is going to make damn sure that you don't talk in front of people ever again. It'll just go right through your amygdala. It'll go right through the brainstem, and it'll just fire it right in your body. There's no way we're doing this ever again. And I think this is the origin of panic attacks as well too. So it's really learning that these parts, the earlier they're incarnated, the more powerful they seem to be.
They are, yeah. They can completely take over. They can and do. And I like what you said about trust, because it is a process. But what I find, and this is really amazed me when I first started working with people, is that it is so much faster than with a real kid. Again, there's such a different sense of time in the inner world, and these parts have been so desperate for so long in there for help.
Agreed.
And to be heard. They are usually within a session. It's pretty rare that there's not some trust established with self, to where the part will acknowledge, okay, you're here to help. I get it. Share some things with the self so that relationship building can start. This is not a long, drawn-out process. Typically, it can be, depending on the severity of the trauma. But I've been amazed and frankly reassured by how quickly that trust usually develops, because that's step one. And the part's not going to. You can't get anywhere.
The child wants it desperately.
Yeah.
So, what did IFS do for you, Terry? If you don't mind me getting into a personal kind of question.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate that. I was super, super shy as a kid, zero confidence, made fun of in school a lot, picked on, bullied, which shut me down even more.
Sure.
And what I found was that when I got into IT, like not until I started working and I was good at IT, did anything resembling self-confidence come into the picture, because I just had nothing. So the result of all that was, again, I was confident at work. So I felt good at work, and then I was working 60, 70 hours a week at one point, because that felt good.
Yeah.
That I'm in my zone.
Can't blame you.
At that point, but no confidence outside of that. Relationships, friendships, romantic relationships, and it just absolutely zero. Really shut down, very hyper analytical. As you noted earlier, like it was very left brain dominant.
Yep.
For a very long time.
I relate to all this, by the way. Keep going.
Oh, good. Yeah. And so, what did IFS do? Well, it puts me in touch with that right side of the brain. that you mentioned, and now there's such a shift in terms of, I mean, not only, confidence is all there. I mean, that's fine, but just this aspect of life that I was missing out on, the emotional side of it, rather than being Spock all the time, every minute, which is a very intelligent, adaptive strategy.
Yeah.
But also life is very bland at that point. So getting in touch with these parts who are carrying, again, these attachment wounds. I didn't have any big T stuff, but it was quite a bit of, the cumulative developmental trauma, which
and
piles
you're
up.
obviously a sensitive person. So, that's the other thing that we talked about before we went on. Is like, you can be born sensitive, which I believe that we are. You ask any mother which of their kid is which kid is the most sensitive, they will tell you immediately which one is the most sensitive. So it's just like that sensitivity makes us exquisitely sensitive to bullying, rejection, abandonment, loss, abuse, especially. So, and that drives the parts. So it's in my opinion anyway. So it is one of those things that it sounds to me like this allowed you to kind of get a 360 view of yourself, and literally and figuratively, and this ability to kind of go, okay, maybe there is something outside of this.
Very much, yeah. And by healing the parts in there who are carrying all this pain, because again, this bottom up, right? So if I try to tell myself, be more outgoing, be more confident, be more emotional, there's no chance.
That would be top down, by the way.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So by doing it in the bottom up way, like, okay, let's heal these parts who are hurt in there, who are scared of connecting with people, scared of feeling emotions. Then we just, as a natural consequence, I don't have to try to feel anymore. Like the parts aren't blocking it anymore. I don't have to try to connect with people.
Sorry to interrupt, but as you were saying before, the self-compassion comes up naturally.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just a natural, we have these 8 C's of self. Compassion is one of them. This is where I disagree. Like Buddhism, I love for the most part, but this notion of meditating on compassion for hours every day that the Dalai Lama talks about, it's already in there. Like you don't have to do that. You have to do that when there's trauma blocking it, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, I agree with you.
You clear the trauma. It's a natural quality of self. Compassion, curiosity, clarity, all these C words that Dick Schwartz came up with. So yeah, it's almost hard to describe in some ways, honestly, like the difference now in what I experience day to day, how I experience the world. But clearing all that stuff out of there, really, it's just such an opening, and without, I mentioned earlier traditional therapies being based on the principle of addition. Right. And what I didn't say is IFS is based on releasing constraints. So we clear that stuff out of there, heal those parts, get the trauma out. Now we're free to feel these things like compassion that are already there, and connection, which is a natural human drive unless we're traumatized. Those things just come, and it's been an amazing journey.
Yeah, we're not ruled by it so much. And I think there is something when you start doing it for yourself, when you start feeling it for yourself, there is this holistic sense in you that, oh, I am going to be okay. I'm not just learning these skills to help me cope. I'm actually getting to the root cause of the issue and beginning this process of healing. Whatever, healing's kind of a complex word for sure, but it's just learning that, yeah, I can handle these uncomfortable feelings as they come up. I don't have to run away from them. In my language, there's alarm in your body. And when the alarm comes up, and I call it background alarm because it's the background experiences of your life, background sensitivity that you have, and it sort of sits in the background of your consciousness. But if something triggers it, like that woman who heard the woman yelling at her child across the aisles, we lose that ability to kind of see the forest for the trees, and we regress back into this place, and we don't actually allow ourselves to stay in that uncomfortable place. So then we have all these sort of managers and firefighters that jump in and say, no, you can't feel that. And like I said earlier, we never actually metabolize the underlying root cause of the problem, because every time we go into it, we've got this coping strategy, this management strategy. So it's like it's like you've got a bunch of bricks in your backyard. You want to build a shed. And then you go out to the bricks and you sort of pick one up and you go, I need to read another book on how to make the plumbing system before I do this. So the bricks sit there, the trauma sits there, and it never actually gets dealt with, because every time you approach it, it's uncomfortable. You go, I don't want to do this because it's just going to be too much work. And then you just shelve it for a while and it never gets dealt with. So one of the things I like about IFS and somatic experiencing, and to some extent compassion inquiry, although I don't know a lot about it, is about allowing yourself to feel that feeling. And in somatic experiencing, they would say, yes, you can feel that feeling, but we do it in this gradual way through the body. And IFS is like, we'll take these parts and we'll find these parts almost semi-cognitively, bring them up so that we have some sort of mental image of them to work with as well, and process that through somatically, and process that, cognitively as well. But just presenting this alternate way of allowing yourself to feel the pain.
Right. Yeah. And again, a very different experience than we think it's going to be when we're used to being overwhelmed. We're used to it being too much. And a lot of these are implicit memories from before we
Totally.
There's not a narrative here. We just know that we fear feeling the emotions because you meant the brain likes to explain itself. But it's an implicit fear that's in the unconscious. We were too young to lay down long-term memories at that point. So it's just there, and it's driving us, and we avoid, addictions, phones, being busy all the time, which is rewarded in this culture, anything to keep us away from what's in there. And again, it was all intelligent at the time. And every, when someone embarks on a healing journey, what that says to me, because it was true for me, is that they've gotten to a point where it's untenable.
Right.
Untenable to keep going this way. Like something's got to give. Either something bad happened, like a divorce or something like that, or it just piles up to the point, there's this midlife crisis we like to talk about. Like something's got to give.
Yep.
Something like that starts. Something, the symptoms get more serious. Absolutely. And that's when the journey starts. And if we can there's so many approaches out there that I think unfortunately, they sound good on the surface, and I look at, quite frankly, mindfulness meditation this way. I think if you look at the tens of millions of books on that have been sold over the last 20 years, are we more mindful now as a culture? No. Why? It's not because it is bad. It's because when there's trauma, people can't stick to it.
No.
Like people try it for a month and then they're right back to the patterns they were in before. And so again, the bottom up, when the trauma clears, now all of a sudden, I can meditate better.
Right.
I can do yoga, whatever appeals to me, and I'm not so distracted all the time, and I'm not keeping myself so busy day to day as a distraction that I don't have time for these things that really are valuable in my life.
One of the things that I really like doing is cold plunges. So it is one of those things when you first go into the cold. I guess you're American, so I'll try and translate this into Fahrenheit. But it's, you go into something that's 54 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's unbelievably painful. Oh my God, is it painful? Your mind is just screaming at you to get out of the water, And now I can handle stuff that's pretty close to freezing, but I had to do that gradually. And then there was this sense in me, there's a part of me that knows I can get out of this anytime I want. So when I was a child, there was no escape. Yeah. But in this cold plunge, even though it's excruciatingly painful at points, I'm still doing it. I'm still holding myself here. And in a way, it's analogous. It's like allowing yourself to slowly adapt to more and more physical discomfort, because the emotion is physically uncomfortable. And then you start seeing, I can handle this. And then you kind of get into this thing where, you walk through the spa and all these people are like, I can't go in here. And I just jump right in. And they're like, how the hell do you do that? It's like, well, I built myself up to it. So I really love that analogy of initially when I first went in at 54 degrees, it was unbearable. Like it was really painful and I could only stay in there for 30 seconds. And then after a while, like you're in there is this kind of sense that comes upon you. It's like 5 seconds of excruciating pain and then 5 seconds of, you know what? This is actually okay. And then 5 seconds of horrible pain and then 5 seconds of, yeah, I'm doing it. Yeah, this is okay. This is okay. And then over the course of time, so that's the analogy that I draw, is that when you go into your alarm, it's going to be really painful. So you have to take it in these increments. But once you learn, and this is, I think, analogous to the self kind of taking over and getting this sense that, you know what, I have got your back. I will support you. There is this sense that, yes, that was painful. My immediate response was to get the hell out of it. But now I'm able to stay with it because there's a power in me that I did not know before. And in this, it sounds kind of trivial in a way, in that I can stay in freezing cold water for way, way longer than I ever was able to before. And it's kind of analogous. You can stay in this emotional pain, for longer. And as you do that, you gain this sense like, you know what? It's actually not that bad. But initially it was horrible.
Yeah, and I'd be curious to ask you, because I know for me, and if I can't speak for the people I work with based on what I see. I suspect the healing that we do with the parts, certainly for me, is easy. I'd rather do that than a cold plunge. Like, because I've tried the cold shower thing, it is
Right.
insufferable to
I
me.
don't like cold showers.
Yeah.
I don't like cold showers.
I would rather heal trauma.
Yeah, it's just not. I don't think it's just not enough. I think it's I can't get used to the water hitting me. But if I go in and I'm submerged in it, there is something about there's a holistic piece to that. So but the analogy that I'm drawing is that initially it's painful, but there's a huge reward. Yeah. And I think in this society, when we feel initial pain, we just like go into our medications, addictions, distractions, and dissociations, and then we never actually deal with the root cause, which I think what IFS does to some extent, other therapies, certainly somatic experiencing does, is show you that you can actually, you can handle this pain. And not only there is something in you that's greater than what you perceive that will come up to save you, because when you were a child, that wasn't there, but it's there now.
And it's so empowering.
Sorry I keep jumping in.
Sure. Yeah.
But it was there when you were a child, but you just didn't have a chance to see it. Now, as an adult, because the self is always there. It's the universal part of us, but we just don't see it. We lose connection with it. And now we can see, oh, there is this part of me that actually will look after me.
Yeah. And I really find it empowering because, like you said, when we're distracting ourselves, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, usually the latter, there's a sense that, I can't deal with this, so I need to distract myself from it. And when we turn towards it rather than fighting it, we learn pretty quickly, you know what, I can handle this, because the reality is I already lived through the worst part of it. True. It's never going to be as bad as it was, and I was much younger then, right? So I can survive now as an adult what happened. So that is very empowering, was for me, and that's what I see. Where and as soon as that first part is healed, there's such a reward there to know. Okay, now there's such a motivation. Okay, let's see who else in there is carrying this pain, because I can do this. Yeah. Self can handle it.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely true. Is there anything, like, I'm going to ask people how they can, or tell people how they're going to find you, but is there anything that you want to sort of say that we haven't touched on? Or, if there was, sometimes people will say, if there was one thing about IFS that made the huge difference for you, what was that? Is there a point that you really wanted to kind of, emphasize?
We've hit on so much. I would reiterate the turning towards with curiosity, with compassion. Again, we don't have to really even try to do that. It's just there. So, because when we want to suppress a part who's carrying pain, that's another part who wants to do the suppressing. Yeah. So when we separate from that one, now there's three of us, in this example there. And self is able to talk to this one who wants to suppress first and say, hey, I can handle this. Are you open to me trying? And pretty quickly, usually the part will say, well, I don't believe you, but I'm open to you trying, because I'm tired of doing this. Like, they're exhausted. And there's we talked about. So that turning towards the compassion, the curiosity that naturally result, that is almost a 180, as we talked about, from what most therapies are, most healing approaches are. And it just puts us on a completely different path. And it's a beautiful thing to see. It's been an amazing thing to go through myself. And for those who haven't tried a therapy like this, again, something bottom up that asks why and gets to causes, I can't recommend it enough.
Me too. So where can people find you, Terry?
They can find me, so healingtheself.net is my website. And I'll give you my Instagram as well, which you can link to. It's terry.baranski on Instagram. I do one-on-one work. I'm getting into some online group stuff now. I've been doing group events here locally in DC for some time, and I'm going to take that online and, just experimenting, seeing what resonates with people. But starting those up next month, you can find info about that on the site. And it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been great, Terry. Yeah, it's been really great. I can really see that you have a passion for this work. So thanks for being here.
My pleasure.